I would just like to, again, welcome everybody to our webinar for tonight. My name is Dalton Savage, and I'm one of the education coordinators here at the National Council for History Education, joined by my colleague, Shauna. Welcome. We're really excited for you to be here. Again, we're really excited to have Rob Briwa here. He is going to be presenting on Black homesteaders on the Great Plains, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Again, as you navigate throughout the conversation tonight, if you have questions, please pop them in the chat, into the Q&A. That way we can get those answered. Again, I just want to say thank you so much for taking time out of your day, especially close to the holidays, and joining us tonight. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Rob.
Thank you for that introduction. I'm really pleased to be here tonight. My name is Rob Briwa. I'm the Education Program Specialist at Homestead National Historical Park. And if you have any questions that don't get responded to tonight, feel free to pop me an email at robert_briwa@nps.gov, and I'll get to them as soon as I can. I love hearing from curious people post-program, so it'll be a real pleasure. And tonight, I really want to demonstrate a little bit about what it is we do at Homestead National Historical Park, and then dig into the story of Black homesteaders across the Great Plains, both in broad terms as well as through a couple of case studies. And so if you've got questions, you can pop them in the chat and I'll try and keep up. Or I will leave the Q&A open, just so I can see what comes in that way. And you can ask them at any time. And if I'll try and get to them as it happens. And it could be that if I have material on that at some point in the chat, I'll change courses and get there. So feel pretty happy to just see where we go with the flow of this presentation tonight. But I'd love to start with a broad overview of where I am and what we talk about at Homestead National Historical Park. I am, well, Homestead National Historical Park is one of 432, as of today, park units in the United States managed by the National Park Service. And I like to think of national parks as those places that tell national stories. And the story of Homestead National Historical Park is that of the Homestead Act of 1862 and all of its impacts across North America. So where you see that red star behind me, that's where I'm calling you from today. I'm at a little park just outside of the small town of Beatrice, Nebraska. And we're located where we are because that is the first 160 acres filed under the Homestead Act of 1862. Now, that law is a law signed into effect by Abraham Lincoln that says this: if you were 21 or the head of household, if you were an American citizen or had a pathway towards citizenship, and if you hadn't borne arms against the United States, then you could apply for up to 160 acres of a federal domain. And that land would become yours if you built a house on it of a certain size, if you put a certain number of acres under cultivation, and if you lived on that land for 5 years. Now, there's a whole lot of impacts from that. And at Homestead National Historical Park, we kind of interpret 5 broad themes, maybe 6, depends on how you catch me on any given day. And the first is this: when Lincoln signs that law into effect, he's thinking very strategically from the perspective of the United States in the midst of the Civil War. And so that's why you see that clause of couldn't be eligible and file for a homestead claim if you had borne arms against the United States. But it also is a strategic decision because Lincoln is in the midst of a United States that is actively expanding against indigenous peoples in the continental, what becomes the US. And so what might be claimed as federal land is already occupied by indigenous folk, and their lives are disrupted. right? Many different ways through which that occurs, both through direct displacement through treaty signing and the rise of reservations, to protracted armed conflict, to, undercutting the economic bases of indigenous lifeways. Happy to geek out about that. We actually do another program on that too. So that's one of the major impacts that we interpret at the Homestead Act, at Homestead National Historic. Another major impact is that when you create a whole lot of farmers, and the whole idea of the Homestead Act is to create smallholder farmers to settle these federal lands. Well, farmers transform landscapes. And so many of the landscapes that we find around North America become irrevocably shaped, and the ecology is disrupted by the Homestead Act. One of the classics is the tall grass prairie, the ecosystem that once stretched from about Ohio out to about the 100th meridian, gets largely plowed under. Only about 4% of that remains. Most of that's also restored. So disruptions to indigenous livelihoods, disruptions to ecologies. And then we can think about how homesteading impacts not only North American settings, but also has an international dimension. Because the Homestead Act allowed for those who had a path towards citizenship or who were already American citizens to apply for a homestead claim. You see through the 1860s and 1870s waves of migration from places that had pathways towards citizenship. In the 19th century, that was largely Europe. And so Eastern seaboard cities and cities of the old Midwest, these places begin to boom as they serve as conduits for immigrants to the United States, many of whom decide to become homesteaders, many of whom stay in urban places. And so you see that pattern. But then you also see that while homesteading is occurring in these quote unquote rural places, right, there's a real relationship between urban spaces and the rural. And you see almost not quite a second industrial revolution, but rather a deepening of industrial development in many cities in the ways that they produce commodities and in response to the demand for commodities by homesteaders. So a minor example of that is, a steel plow, right, doesn't get produced in homesteading communities. No, it's getting mass produced in a place like Chicago and sent via rail lines out into homesteading locations. And the vice versa, the reverse flow of commodities is that homesteaders are producing raw materials that then get processed in city spaces. Think your grains, your cattle, orchards, and the like. And so have to think about the interconnectedness between places and how that's playing out within the United States. And then you can look at the language of the law and see how it affords new opportunities for marginalized groups in 19th century American society that then has longer term effects down the line. And it all links to the language of the law. For women, the Homestead Act's law was written in a way that allowed for women to own property. And that was a federal precedent. They only had to be 21 or the head of household. So widows or unmarried women could apply to become homesteaders, and they did. Before, property ownership as it related to land was something left up to the states. But with the Homestead Act coming into play, you end up seeing that, federal mandate for women to own land. And with land ownership in the 19th century in mind, there's also ideas of civic participation. And so while the women's suffrage movement predates the Homestead Act, and the 19th Amendment gets passed during the Homestead Act, one of the big things that you find time and again is that women homesteaders add economic weight to arguments that were being argued by suffragists in other places along idealistic lines. And it is women homesteaders who successfully push for real suffrage in Western territories and states well before the 19th Amendment. And finally, and the talk that we're going to dig into today, is that following the conclusion of the Civil War, there's a great question in the United States, which is, what do you do with formerly enslaved folk in a United States that no longer has slavery as an institution? And the Homestead Act, because it does not make any reference to race, offers a pathway for Black Americans to apply for homestead claims. And we're going to dig into that because there's a couple of steps that we have to think about along the way. But that's our broad set of impacts. And the final one that I like to geek out about is that when we're working in park spaces, yes, we're engaging in historical education, but we're also engaging in this idea of making things relevant to people, right? I firmly believe that national parks are special places, but that the real benefit of parks is that you can go to them and then take and have a new eye and understanding of the home places that you were coming. And for the Homestead Act, there are long-standing transformations that are still legible across the United States today. One of them is this. That map behind me is a choropleth map, right? And it is demonstrating that you have brown states, green states. All of the states in brown, those are places where homestead claims were filed. All of the states in green, there were no homestead claims filed there. However, as we've already discussed, those places are nonetheless shaped by homesteading. And in the longer term, I don't know the precise population of the United States at this moment in time, something like 338 million, right? But as far as we can estimate, around 93 million folk are descended from homesteaders. The Homestead Act spanned 123 years. That is one of those laws that infiltrates almost every aspect of American society during that period. And it impacts more than one nation, right? When we think about indigenous nations as well. That's my pitch. Come out to southeastern Nebraska sometime to visit Homestead National Historical Park, and we can geek out all day. But today, what I would love to dig into is that of Black homesteader experiences. And I'd love to start with the American South in the aftermath of the Civil War. Hold on a moment. I just have to wave to turn on some lights here. Now, in the aftermath of the Civil War, there is a big social question, which is that you have formerly enslaved folk, and the question is, how are they going to be integrated into society? And so one of the big things that is being discussed is that of the livelihoods of formerly enslaved. And you see in the Reconstruction era South a whole lot of attempts through legislation to end up setting the stage for formerly enslaved folk to find an economic base in the American South. Many of you might have heard the phrase 40 acres and a mule. In the chat, have you heard that phrase before? Yes or no? Yeah. So really broadly, the 40 acres and a mule idea emerges out of post-Civil War South, where one response to the question of what to do with formerly enslaved folk is to provide them with 40 acres upon which they can, and the equipment necessary, upon which they can set up a life as a smallholder farmer. And the rationale behind that was twofold. One was most former slaves were involved in agriculture in the American South when they were slaves. And so the idea was that this was a directly transferable skill set. And then two, where was the land coming from? Well, some of it was federal, and there are also ideas of breaking up former plantations to provide that land. Now, very quickly, that 40 acres and a mule idea gets revived, right? Effectively, when President Andrew Johnson pardons Confederate officers and returns to them their holdings. And so in 1866, there is another act that comes into being, and that is the Southern Homestead Act of 1866. And that idea says that there are federal lands in a number of southern states. We can see them there in brown in the south, right? Florida, Mississippi, and the like. Right? And on those federal lands, Black Americans could apply for at first 80 acres and then extended to 160 acres. And they had to file a small fee of about initially $10, but then $5. And then they had to do a lot of proving up, much in the same way as you might prove up a homestead claim under the 1862 Act. And with the Southern Homestead Act, the 1862 Homestead Act was also opened up to Black Americans. We'll return to that in a couple of minutes, because this Southern Homestead Act is a really fascinating moment in time. Many Black Americans do take advantage of this act and demand by Black Americans for pursuing the opportunities offered by the Southern Homestead Act far exceeds the infrastructure put in place to support that act. There was a Freedmen's Bureau that was underfunded and didn't have a really great way of connecting with the constituencies it was mandated to serve, right? The land offices where Black Americans would file claims, they were located in few and far between places throughout the American South. And then, even with the reduction of the filing fee to $5, it was found that many Black Americans just didn't have the startup capital to make it work in Southern landscapes. And compounding that is that you find a lot of the larger structures of the American South in the aftermath of the Civil War really presenting an obstacle towards successful homesteading by former slaves in the American South. One of them is structural racism in pretty much all aspects of Reconstruction era South politics and policy, right? And the way that that society structures itself. Another is that you find that after federal garrisons leave, and I forget what precise year that is, you find a spike in racialized violence, direct violence against Black Americans. Lynchings begin to spike in the Reconstruction period. And the third is that political participation, already incredibly limited by those other factors, is by and large restricted even further through poll watching, right? And so Alicia, in the questions here, nails it on the head. There's a lot of push factors from the American South, right, for Black Americans. And simultaneously, there's a lot of pull factors elsewhere. One of those pull factors is the Homestead Act of 1862 and the ways that the Great Plains are being settled. And so exodusters are those who are fleeing the American South for specific places in the Great Plains to carve out a new way of life in Great Plains states. And here's a question for the chat. Any guesses as to which state becomes the key destination for exodusters in the 1870s? It is Kansas. Yes. The follow-up is why. Any guesses as to why Kansas is a place that has an almost mythological importance for exodusters in the 1870s? Christina almost gets it there. John Brown. Yep. So Kansas was a place where you had militant abolitionists fighting to keep Kansas a free state. And John Brown was one of those who was heralded as a hero of the abolitionist movement. Right? And so exodusters, all through from about 1877 to about 1879, you see thousands of Black Americans going out to Kansas. And they're talking about it, right? So this is a letter that was sent to the Kansas governor, right? And it is written by an exoduster. And I think that because we can all read here, I'll just leave it up behind me there for a moment. And I'd like to highlight the two ideas that are held there. One is you see the pull factor of the Homestead Act. And two, you see that factor of just recognizing that this is a place that has become symbolic of abolitionist movements during the Civil War. And so exodusters really emerge and begin to demonstrate two patterns that we'll see playing out time and again in other places impacted by the Homestead Act. And that is this: when exodusters are leaving the American South, they're looking to take advantage of the Homestead Act, file a claim, and pursue life as pursuing the kind of opportunity of being a human farmer, small independent farmer. And so there are a couple ways that occurs. One is that you could be what was termed an independent Black homesteader. Now, these were Black homesteaders, or intended to become Black homesteaders, who would file at a general land office with their claim, or for their claim, with no coordination with any other Black folk, right? They would just kind of file a claim with the general rank and file of whoever walked in to file claims that day. And then they would go out to their claim, and they might not necessarily know who their neighbors were. Lots of exodusters did that. You find lots of evidence of that in other places throughout the Great Plains as well. Southeastern Nebraska had a number of them. Central Nebraska had a number of them. Oklahoma as well. And independent Black homesteaders had highly variable experiences of their times on the plains. And there's a lot of reasons for that. What are some reasons that you can think about? Why might there be highly variable experiences for independent Black homesteaders on the plains in terms of explaining what their lives looked like? Yeah, so Charlene hits one of the problems that most homesteaders face, which is just your location can be highly variable. You don't know what you're going to get necessarily. Patricia suggests different size families and different amounts of resources. That's definitely something that independent Black homesteaders had to wrestle with, especially in the early homesteading period. You are in this interesting moment in time where agricultural labor is partially mechanized, but for most independent Black homesteaders, it wouldn't have been. So more hands makes labor easier. Yeah. What other things come to mind? Yeah, Aaron and Melissa and Kevin are all hitting a lot of, as well as Jennifer, are all hitting those other factors that are being uh, considered, right? One is, you might not have the skills to be an independent homesteader alone. It takes a lot of skills to run a household, right? Another is that, you might have problems with local neighbors, right? Yes, it might be a post-Civil War American Great Plains, but there are still persistent structures of racism in the Great Plains. A lack of financial support or a lack of a clear path towards an immediate living to put cash on the table while you're trying to prove up. There might be a lack of markets. That's totally a factor too, right? Or there might be racialized layouts to communities. Or there might be issues with tribes, though for the most part, homesteading occurs in places where tribal conflict had already met a resolution, right? Either through armed conflict or treaty signing prior to that period, or both. And yeah, there's competition from other homesteaders, certainly. And then there's the general challenges that you might experience as any homesteader might. All in all, a minority of Black homesteaders file for independent homestead claims. About 25%. Just like you or I, they thought through the many factors that might make their attempt to homestead independently successful or unsuccessful, and made that complex algebra work, right, in that decision making. As far as records can tell, independent Black homesteaders proved up at about the same rates as the general populace. So 50 to 60% success rates, depending on where they were in the country. Interestingly, while many Black homesteaders undoubtedly did face racism, many more are facing a lack thereof. And in places like Kansas, they are commented upon positively in local newspapers. There's a lot of fascinating research ideas that can come from that. Like, how are the newspapers perceiving their communities and leveraging holding up positive experiences for Black homesteaders, for example? Another might be, well, when you're looking at the text, you have to think about the silences in that text, right? But then you also find that a lot of these papers are documenting, especially when obituaries come around, the contributions of independent Black homesteaders to the community, right? That then can be cross-referenced through other references. And you also see that there is even some examples of intermarriages along racial lines and the like. So I want to emphasize that the independent Black homesteading experience is a minority of Black homesteaders and an incredible diversity of experiences. So the other model that you find is this: coordinated associations and colony style homesteading. And I put colonies in air quotes because that's what I find used in the scholarship, but it isn't linked to the structure of, say, colonialism, right? Rather, it's referring to organized communities by Black homesteaders who pool their resources. They will go to a single general land office. They will all file claims relatively adjacent to one another, and oftentimes they would travel out together to those claims and uh, provide mutual aid in those spaces in the process of proving up. And there's a number of Black colonies popping up across the plains. The studies that I am most familiar with are considering case studies of around 9 communities across Great Plains. Let me pull that up. And there we go. So we're looking here at a map of the Great Plains region, right? And the darker green there, those are all states that have been under a recent large-scale study achieved by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And Oklahoma was more speculative, but there's a lot of Black homesteading in Oklahoma. The settlements that you see spread across that map behind me, those are all Black colonies. They're all connected to one another. And there is a lot of exchange between these Black colonies. But the question for the chat here, what are some advantages beyond the mutual aid that I've already described in coordinating your efforts on settling as a colony rather than independent? Yeah, two of the big ones is when labor oftentimes has very acute needs. You want to pile a whole bunch of people into achieving tasks, things like building houses or the harvest or the planting season. Lots of skills, right? While an individual might not have all the skills they need to run a homestead, the neighbors might have the skills that can fill in some of those gaps, right? Mutual safety and protection. Yeah, definitely a factor, right? And safety in numbers. There's also the built-in shared experiences and shared experiences of the South, as well as shared experiences of homesteading the plains together, right? And cultural continuity. And yeah, strength in numbers, right? Takes a community, and homesteading, while oftentimes mythologized as kind of an independent thing, across the board is a community endeavor for where homesteaders are most successful. And you see that especially the case in Black colonies across the plains. And I would love to now zoom in on a couple of those case studies, because I think it exemplifies a lot of the points that you guys just raised here. And the first is that of DeWitty, Nebraska. And I think I have a better map of that here. And I will find it in just a moment, or I'll leave it up behind me here. I'll leave it up behind me here. So DeWitty, Nebraska is in the sand hills of Nebraska. If you've ever been out to the sand hills, it's a whole lot of nothing. It is a relatively arid part of Nebraska of shifting sand dunes that have been locked into place by shortgrass prairie. And DeWitty, Nebraska is a Black homesteading community that is almost this interesting space of not quite second generation Black homesteaders, but certainly experienced Black homesteaders. And what I mean by that is this. Many Black homesteaders filed independent claims and received 160 acres under the Homestead Act of 1862. And they were successful, right? However, by the time the Homestead Act of 1862 reaches places like the western portions of Nebraska, legislators recognize that aridity is a factor that means that 160 acres is not enough to support a homesteading family. And so they expand the total number of acres that a single family can apply for. And the first time that is enacted is under the Kincaid Act of 1904, which specifically said this: the sandhills of Nebraska are really, really harsh places to live. So let's expand the total number of acres a homesteader can apply for to up to 420, I believe. Might be off on that. It might be 640. It's either 420 or 640. And the Kincaid Act was open to the general populace. And it also had the clause that said, if you already filed 160 claims elsewhere, you could file the remainder in the sandhills. And for many Black homesteaders who had proved up in another location, yet were living independently, they thought that it would be a nice way to establish a Black community in the sandhills. And so they filed the remainders of their claims out in the sandhills in a coordinated effort. And that is why in the map you see above me, the township at range map, you see uneven sizes of green blotches, right? Those are the claims that are filed. Each of the numbers in that claim that you see filed behind me, that corresponds to the person who filed that claim. And if you can read who's filing claims and read their last names, what are you noticing? And if it's too small, just give a shout on that too, because I've had that critique several times. Yeah, there are lots of Emmanuels, and there are somewhere. And Alicia hits on it really well. There's also DeWitt. Yeah. These are extended families that are filing claims together and oftentimes adjacent to one another and not having independent houses, but rather having houses that are built really close together. It is, as Edwin suggests, a support system, right? And so that's what you see playing out in DeWitt, right? These communities begin to really start popping in these inhospitable places, right? Because communities are creating institutions, and they are creating institutions of mutual aid. I will hold up a couple of those institutions that we have photographic evidence of, right? The first is that any community worth its salt had a post office, right? And DeWitt was big enough to have a post office, which meant that he was connected not only to other communities or neighbors and the like, but it was also connected to other Black homesteading communities and the wider world, right? A rail line never reaches DeWitt, but it did have mail service coming in and out. Another fascinating institution that comes into place is some of you notice that, yeah, there's some extended families, and they are filing claims that are adjacent to one another. And oftentimes, you have interesting living arrangements pop up. So what we have here behind me is a photograph of a family in DeWitt, and I've forgotten their names. But I believe Nebraska history has this photograph annotated. But we can look at this image and see a lot and infer a lot about daily lives for this family. One is this. We're actually looking, well, you know what? I'll let you guys interpret it. What do you see in the photograph behind me that is eye-catching and that can tell you about the lives lived in DeWitt starting in around 1908? There's multiple generations going. Yeah, there is. Dogs are always sitting on chairs for some reason in these photographs, if you look at not a lot of them. But yeah, you have sod houses as well. And these are hard lives. Yep, those are sod houses. No timber in the sand hills. And if it was available, it was a hot commodity. So sod houses, it takes a lot of labor to put together. And you see some of that come into play. Charlene points out that, yeah, there's equipment in the background, multiple horses at this point. Um, and other equipment as well. So I can elaborate on sod houses. They are a common form of housing in the arid Great Plains. And basically it takes a day or two of labor of a team of men who know how to make a sod house to put one together. And in DeWitty, we have evidence of Black homesteaders pooling their labor to produce sod houses, not only for the community, but also selling their wages for neighboring white communities and hiring themselves out to build sod houses. Um, oh, let's see here. We do see other equipment out there. We see a pile of barrels and chairs and other equipment, which has actually been moved outdoors. For this photograph opportunity. It's a common thing that you see amongst homesteaders is when a photographer comes in to town, as it were, it's a big event and everyone piles their stuff outside so that they can show they have it in them, right? And a photograph like that might be mailed to family members living elsewhere. And, oh, yeah, it is a way to show prosperity. You see it time and again, right? And oh, I've seen images where you see pianos out, right? You also see pride. This is a prideful moment. This is showing success, especially because many of the homesteaders in DeWitty were former slaves who had filed 160 acres once, proved up successfully, then filed again and proved up successful. And they're doing interesting things and creating opportunities for that multiple generational setting that former slaves did not have access to. And one of those things that I would like to showcase is another institution. What are we looking at here? Christina nails it. We're looking at a one-room schoolhouse and the students and teacher of that one-room schoolhouse. And this is a pattern that is most strongly articulated in DeWitty, but then it also transfers to other homestead settings. First is this: in general, homesteaders, black or white, put a premium on public education. You see tens of thousands of one-room schoolhouses across the Great Plains. These were places where civic identities were created. But for Black homesteaders, the pattern emerges that former slaves who did not have access to public education, when given the opportunity to create institutions of public education through paying taxes to fund those institutions, to building those structures, they did so. And they invested heavily in it. And these civic institutions were viewed as the way that Black homesteaders could extend the capital of the homestead. And so these schools become really, really well known. Yeah, Jennifer nails it. Like, this is an investment in success in American society, right? You have people learning in public institutions. They are creating these institutions, they are funding them, and they are taking pride in them. What do we notice about the image behind me here, about the students in this classroom? Students are multi-generational. Yeah, They are wearing their Sunday best. Yep. Yeah, you see the very young to the elderly, right? And that is something that you find in Black homesteading schools, is that you see the age of graduates a little bit older sometimes, because for some folk, this is an opportunity that they didn't have as younger children, right? And then in general, the K through 8 education system oftentimes had graduates as late as about 21 years of age due to the tendency of people to drop in and out of school for labor on the homestead. Some are holding books, yep. And then you are seeing that nobody's smiling because this is serious business, right? And yeah, uh, this was taken in Nebraska. Yep, this is the school of DeWitty. You also note that this school is built out of wood in a way that um, that's a heavy investment in a sod house region. That's a great question, Terry. I can tell you some downstream effects of this in just a moment that might link to the emergence of historically Black colleges. Because one of the things that we find is that Black homesteaders who prove up successfully oftentimes end up having very, very high rates of education relative to the general populace. And that's even considering the general white populace. And one of those emergent things is this. Black homesteaders who prove up successfully oftentimes ended up selling parts of their land to fund the education of their children beyond an 8th grade education. And you would find Black homesteading children going to receive higher education degrees at a time when that was relatively unusual for the general populace as a whole. And what's more is through effectively that letter writing culture that we mentioned earlier and the connectivity of family roots, those individuals returning to homesteading communities to reinvest by applying their skills. And so the teacher here in this image is the man with the stick. And I believe that that is Charles Speaks. It is certainly a member of the Speaks family. I'm not really great with first names, so I have to apologize on that. Charles Speaks had a master's of divinity, right? And he is the school teacher in this public institution, right? So these schoolhouses become really, really well known as places that are high quality and as places where you get a step moving forward. And yeah, I think that these questions about HBCUs is something that a scholar of higher ed in the United States could probably have some really good responses for. So let's take another look at a community institution that is existing within DeWitty. What's the institution we have behind me here? It's not the school. Yep, you're all getting it. It is not the hospital. There were no medical facilities in DeWitty, though there were people with the skills to be medicinal, right? It is the church. It was a Protestant church. It was Episcopalian, and this is the congregation, also wearing their Sunday best, which suggests a manner of incredible pride in that institution. This is a community center, right? It is more than just a place of worship. It is also where people gather to engage in community building, right? And yeah, they may very well be ushers. Those of you who are more versed in the social life and norms of church probably can see this and see direct parallels to church experiences today, right? In the front there, we see the two ministers of the church. One of them is Charles Spies, and I forgot the name of the other. And you can see that they are leaders of that community. There's also a mixed marriage in this image, which was between a white man and a black woman who had met when she was the daughter of an independent black homesteader in Custer County, which is another county in Nebraska. And together they moved to DeWitt to start up another claim, and both proved up successful. So lots can be gleaned from these images. And we can take a look at other aspects of their lives, right? Oh, this is recreation in DeWitt. This is just hunting was an activity that took place out in the sand hills. Let's see. And then there's this going on. So this is the DeWitt Sluggers team, which was an organized baseball team, which suggests a lot. And yeah, we do see interracial relationships popping up quite a bit. Thank you. In this particular community. So the baseball team behind me here were the DeWitt Sluggers. They were funded by the community, organized uniforms and the like. And this demonstrates a really interesting moment in DeWitt's history that we can take a guess at, which is this. The DeWitt Sluggers, of course, practiced with one another and maybe had scrimmage games. But who else are they playing in the Sandhills? What does that suggest about other communities in the Sandhills? They're playing with predominantly white communities. The nearest community to DeWitt is the town of Brownlee, and that is over 25 miles away. The DeWitt Sluggers would play at Brownlee a lot of the time for multiple days at a time. And it was a huge festival that would happen there. I'll have to get to Kevin's question in just a moment because I'll have a counter question. And then other communities that of Ballantyne, which is over 40 miles away and was the county hub. DeWitt Sluggers would play there for several days at a time. So Kevin asks a question in the chat that says, hey, what kind of political impacts did they have on local communities and states? I can speak to this in all sort of general terms. We know that in some of these small Black homesteading communities, you had people who are highly educated and in rural places where they become a political figure, right? They might not be running for office, but they might be doing things like holding the position of postmaster or minister. And these are inherently political positions in the way that they serve as community heads. More broadly, I'm aware of one instance in another Black homesteading community, that of Empire, Wyoming, where racialized violence occurs in the nearby community, and it is a Black homesteader who attempts to bring this into a court of law, and eventually the court case is thrown out. Right? So there is definitely instances where political participation is curtailed. Right? And I guess the counter question, and feel free to answer this in the chat, Kevin, is I don't know what the Grange movement is. So please feel free to answer in the chat what that looks like. And that's about all I can speak to Black participation in politics, is that I know that it's happening, but maybe not in the formal political sphere, but rather when you think about how communities interrelate as a form of power dynamics, right? Um, and then, yeah, so Karen and Patricia, to get back to the DeWitty sluggers, right, are playing with um, oh, themselves, right, but also with white communities. And in the case of DeWitty, this is recognized as a moment where there's a lack of racial tension. And in fact, in DeWitty, there is social and written memory surrounding people who are Black homesteaders selling labor at market rates in white communities to assist on tasks there. Similarly, they're hiring white workers during key times of the year at market rates. And people are engaging in intermarriage as well as in eventually inter-school, right? Because DeWitty becomes a point in which the citizens of Brownlee are like, oh, shoot, their school facilities are better than ours. Cool. Thank you, Kevin, for the Grange movement explanation. I appreciate it. And so I have a few minutes left here that I would like to showcase because of this, before just kind of throwing it open to the wolves for questions. And that is that if you go to DeWitty today, this is what you see. DeWitty isn't on a map anymore. And if you ever drive the roads of the sandhills, there's only a few of them that are paved. This is what you're looking at. A historical highway marker that was put up relatively recently, representing the approximate location of DeWitty. And if you look at the population graph of DeWitty, it looks like this. 1904, you see some claims filed. You'll see a peak somewhere around 145 residents, and you see the decline. There's a lot going on. I think there's a lot of emotional things that we can bring to this story. There's a lot of analytical things we can bring to this story too. And then we can fold them back together. And that's kind of where I want to head here. Let's start with the analyses. There's nobody in DeWitty by 1938. What factors help explain that? What are the economic factors, the environmental factors? Yeah, see two of them, right? Stock market crash and the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression. We also see in international contexts, yes, Great Depression hits in 29, right? The Dust Bowl begins to be felt in this region in the 30s. But you also see market prices globally of wheat crash when the Soviet Union gets itself together and starts exporting wheat while also extracting wheat from other places within the Soviet Union in profound ways. You see the beginnings of populations drop in and around World War I. The Great Plains does send a disproportionate number of its men to war relative to other parts of the country. Right? So all of those factors are explaining the decline of DeWitty. In contrast to many Black communities, yeah, were there white communities around? There were. DeWitty didn't experience necessarily racism or Jim Crow laws in that area. Other communities certainly did, right? The city of Empire, Wyoming, for example. But rather that, you see labor leaving where it was needed. Yeah, people are proving up successfully. They're investing in agricultural materials, help them mechanize ag, which means less hands, which means you're going elsewhere for economic opportunities as children. You're seeing less migration to the area. as it gets filled in with homesteading claims. Yeah, that's another one too. And another is this. The descendants of DeWitt are not living in rural Nebraska. Rather, people are proving up successfully and selling the land as a form of capital to reinvest in their children. So their children get educated in these spaces. The land is owned and the land gets sold due to a variety of the pressures that we looked at behind us that makes it less valuable as a way of life for those community members. And there's probably a rolling stone effect, right? Once your community begins to hollow out, it will hollow out further. But Black homesteaders exhibit a pattern that many white homesteaders do not exhibit, and that is seeing the land as a form of capital that can be leveraged into other forms of capital. The fixed capital of land can be sold and applied into the social capital of investing. And so we see this, right? We see a community that has disappeared from the landscape. But we also see that the community members and the descendants of DeWitt are in the cities of the Midwest today, and their livelihoods are in part built on, in large part, built on the efforts of their homesteading parents and grandparents and great-grandparents. Right? So this is a scene of when that particular highway marker was put up. A lot of the research done on DeWitt, was achieved through seeking out the descendants and asking for social memory, because this is all within living memory, right? 1904 is within living memory of descendants of that first round of DeWitt homesteaders, right? And the descendants of DeWitt are very, very clear that success in DeWitt looked different than what you might come to expect of holding on to the land through the years. And so I'd like to end with a quotation here from this wider research project of a descendant of DeWitt, who, when asked to evaluate the success of DeWitt, says this: although the town was reclaimed by land, the legacy of homesteaders carries on for they were a success. This town isn't a failure. It's not an experiment. It doesn't wither away because people couldn't handle the weather. It's a testament to vision, which was to set down roots in a foundation of educating children and giving them a chance at the American dream. DeWitt's residents did that. DeWitt's story is successful. Every Black homesteading colony has a different set of stories playing out. Several of them exhibit patterns like this one. Some of them have descendants still living in those spaces today. Nicodemus National Historic Site, for example. Others disappear from the landscape. The ongoing question is how to approach these stories and how to reconstruct them when evidence on the land is. So I am happy to geek out and answer questions for what you got. So thank you so much. This was a real pleasure. My final pitch is, I know that you're instructors. We are always thrilled to offer programs to K through 12 classrooms via this medium. And if you contact me, I can talk to you about how to connect.
Thank you so much, Rob. This was fantastic. I loved your ending too, because we do have another webinar coming up in March that will be led by a high school teacher in North Carolina who got a historic marker in her town for an important event that happened there. So if you're interested in how that happens and how to get historic markers and how to get your students involved in that process, come back and see us in March. Of course, we have lots of other great webinars between now and March. But thank you again for being here tonight. You are free to go. If you have any questions for Rob, he is going to hang out for a few, but this was a really great presentation. I learned a lot. Dalton and I were going back and forth on how great this was. So thank you again. And thank you everyone for being here. And I hope you survive working with the children until the holiday break. Have a great night, everyone.
Yeah, thanks so much. And those of you who, I always like to share my sources because, as you know, you need to share sources, right? So I can provide that if you're interested in looking at the scholarship, because I know I paraphrase a lot, and the scholarship that I draw from has a very, very detailed examination of the lives of individual family members and the like. So I'm happy to provide that bibliography via email down the line. If you'd like to contact me, feel free to email.
All right, thanks again. And if you are just heading out, don't forget to fill out the survey. That helps us to help you. And I'll go ahead and post it in the chat if you missed it going through before. But please take a few moments to fill that out. That helps us to get better. Thanks so much, everyone. And I hope you have a great night.